Say
Well, it's Louise Dampf, Louise, D as in David, A, M as in Mary, P as in Paul, F as in Frank.
Okay. When were you born?
November the 5th, 1902,
Okay. And where were you born?
in St. Charles, Missouri.
Oh. Who were your parents?
Albert W. and Bertha M. Happy, Happy.
Okay. What was your mother's maiden name?
Merschel, Moerschel.
Was she from here?
No, she was originally from St. Louis. She was born in St. Louis. First generation American.
Okay. What sort of job did your father have?
He was in the brewing business. I think he was trained as a plumber in Wheeling, West Virginia, where he was born. And then he came out to Iowa. It was in the brewery business there. And I think his parents were in the brewery business. And probably attending some of the conventions, they met my father's people. So my father and his brother married my mother and her sister.
Oh, so you have
So
double deal.
in Iowa, and then they went to St. Louis, and then to St. Charles, where he was in the brewing business. And we came to Jefferson City in February of 1911, just a few days after the Capitol burned.
Oh.
And I can remember the odor of the smoke from the ruins as we came from North Jefferson to Jefferson City.
Huh.
But it was in 1911, and he was here in the soft drink business, and later was in outdoor advertising.
What soft drink business?
Soft drink business?
And which one was it that he was?
Well, he was an independent bottler, and he had 18 different flavors of soda water, and refused the Coca-Cola Chance franchise because it was dope in his mind.
That's interesting.
He wouldn't have anything to do with Coca-Cola.
I've seen the bottles with a Merschel name on them.
Yes. Well, that's the irony of it, because Prohibition put the brewers out of business, and then my grandfather and his sons went into the soft drink business with Coca-Cola.
Oh, okay. And what brewery did your father work for in St. Charles?
In St. Charles, it was the Merschel Spring Brewery.
Okay. Huh. Now, did he work for a brewery in Jefferson City at first?
No, he came here and bought the W.F. Raisin Bottling Company, and they bottled soft drinks. We had red soda and lemon soda, cream soda, sarsaparilla.
Did you get to drink a lot of soda when you were a child?
Well, I guess we did, comparatively speaking, but not all that much. Some of them now I know drink soda like the water.
Yeah. What sort of games did you play when you were growing up?
Games? Well, when we moved to Jefferson City, we lived on Duncan Street, where the present drive-in bank is. And then my father and mother built a home up on Swift Highway. We were pretty much isolated out there. There weren't very many people out there. So our playmates were our brothers and sisters and neighbors. And we had all kinds of board games. We had, Dad played checkers with us and dominoes.
Huh.
And old maid card game, He liked to play cards, and particularly wanted you to pay attention to what you were doing. He didn't want any nonsense.
Well, if I may ask, the home on Swift's Highway,
Pardon?
the home on Swift's Highway, was that the home that the Milo Walls family
Yes,
bought?
Milo Walls bought it from my dad and mother. She was always real happy about that because she said the house was built for a bunch of children.
Oh, yes.
There were 5 of us, and Milo, I think, had several more.
7 or 8. Yeah, I remember as a child, I was a friend of one of the Walls boys. In fact, we were related, so we spent a lot of Sunday afternoons, up there. So it was very enjoyable.
Well, when we moved up there.
What year was that you moved up there?
Pardon?
What year was that you moved up there?
We moved up there on April 16th, 1914.
1914.
You wouldn't have been, well, about 12 years old then?
Pardon?
You were about 12 years old then?
Yes, I guess so.
Now, were you aware?
I was 11. It was in April, and I would not have been 12 until November.
Were you aware of World War I going on in Europe at that time?
No, not really, excepting Grandfather Marshall, who built Villa Panorama, the other end of the Swiss Highway, maintained a home in Miltenberg in Germany.
Oh, he did?
So he used to go back to Germany almost once a year. And in fact, he was in Germany when World War I broke out. And his son, my Uncle Ernest Marshall, was with him and was of an age and was subject to the draft. So he had to come home to register for the draft.
Oh, here you mean?
He came here to Jefferson City.
Was he in danger of being drafted into the German army while he was...
No, American.
Okay.
No, he was a native-born American.
That would have been 19th century.
Did he serve in the army?
No, Uncle Ernest didn't. He was exempted because he had flat feet. And I didn't, that didn't mean anything to me, excepting I inherited the same thing. Now I'm paying for it.
Well,
Did your grandfather have any trouble getting back with his son?
I can't say that he did, excepting that he had gone over with Uncle Ernst and had taken with him my grandmother's great niece. In 1910, they were in Europe when my youngest brother's twins were born. So grandfather brought 3 German girls back to Jefferson City and 1 to my mother in St. Charles, because there were 6 of us under 8 years of age. I was the oldest. And at that time you didn't have an automatic washer. You didn't have wash and wear clothes. And so grandfather brought a maid from Germany for my mother, for the baby.
Huh.
And she was the niece of an older woman who came with grandfather and grandmother in 1910. And they were both working as, well, 2 of them were working as housemaids, housekeepers for my grandmother and grandfather. And in the meantime, my grandmother died. And my aunt moved into Villa Panorama because her husband had died, my father's brother. She had 4 children, so she was there. And grandfather went with Uncle Ernest and the one Bertha. There were 2 of them. The older one married here, a man by the name of Frank. And he was the father of Ernie Frank. I don't know whether you might have known Ernie Frank here in Jefferson City or not. He was a postal employee. Well, Ernie's father disappeared during World War I and never found trace of him. Ernie was in Germany, in Europe in World War II and made every effort to try to locate his father or somebody who knew something about him, but he was lost completely. But Grandfather took the younger Berta with them over to Germany. And then Uncle Ernst had to come back and left him over there. First thing you know, well, the family was in an uproar because Grandfather had married Berta. And I just know what the reaction was of my mother and her sisters and the rest of the family. And I remember just hearing them say, well, there's no fool like an old fool.
So your grandfather had married the maid, or?
Married the maid, who was my grandmother's great niece. And it really disrupted the family. But as I've learned history and looked back, nobody ever told me this, but I kind of figured that perhaps Grandfather was over there in Europe with her, and she was the house mistress and housekeeper, and he needed her because with that Ida there with 4 children and try to keep that big place, it was more than one woman could do. So he wanted to bring Berta back here, and I think for that reason he married her, not for any other reason.
Did he stay in Germany then, or?
No, he
came
came back here and brought her with him.
Oh, okay.
Nobody ever told me this. That's just my thinking, because I just doubt that she had been made an American citizen during those 3 years from 1910 until 1913. I doubt that. And she got over there in Germany, was a German citizen, and probably she could not come back to the United States, couldn't get out of Germany, excepting Grandpa marries her and brings her out. So that's some of my fantasizing. But that was how the relationship developed there.
What year did they get married?
I guess that was 1914.
Okay. Now, what was your grandfather's name?
Jacob F. Marshall.
Okay, and then the woman he married, what was her name?
Who?
The maid, what was her name?
I never knew her maiden name.
Okay.
She was Berta. And she was the younger of the 2 Bertas. The older one was my grandmother's niece, and my grandmother was Berta. And so the niece was Berta, and her niece was Berta. So it was the older Berta and the younger Berta.
Hard to keep track of.
And, I was about, 8, 9 years old that time, so maiden name didn't mean anything to me.
Do you remember when? Go ahead.
No.
You remember when the Lusitania was sunk?
Pardon?
You remember when the Lusitania was sunk?
Yes.
You remember what the reaction was in the family group about that, or?
No, I don't. I remember the Titanic sinking.
Oh. Huh.
But that was a different episode.
Yeah.
Because I was going to St. Louis to a bone specialist down there for my flat feet. I was staying with my mother's sister, and Aunt Kate came in the morning to get me up because first come, first served with Dr. Hoffman. He didn't make appointments.
No appointments.
And I had to go every day excepting Sunday to get a felt pad under my foot. I had to add one every day to build an arch. And Kate came in the morning and wakened me and handed me the St. Louis Morning newspaper and showed the headlines, thinking of the Titanic. That's why I remember that. That was in 1912, I guess.
April 12th, 1912, or April 15th.
Huh. Can you remember any sentiment against the Germans here when World War I started, when we became involved in it?
Well, there were an awful lot of Germans living around here at that time. And I actually didn't speak English until I started to school. my parents spoke German. And with the younger people in the family, why they spoke German is they didn't want them to understand what they were talking about. But I went off to boarding school after I finished the 8th grade at St. Peter's in 1916. Went to St. Charles, the Academy of the Sacred Heart there. And this was a religious order that originated in France. And they had a lot of French women and Belgian women as members of the order. And they had their families back in Europe. And they hated Germans because the French people and the Belgian people suffered terribly. And that's when I learned that there was that animosity. You hated the Germans. So the fact of the matter was that my mother had elected that I not only have English and Latin and French, which were obligatory for high school students, but take Spanish and German.
You can speak German, though.
So that was kind of a load for a 13-year-old, you know. So we abandoned the Spanish, and later on we gave up the German because when we played games at school, they'd have a French team and a German team. And they always, I'd say we, my cousin, who was a year older than I, was with me at school. And they'd always put us on the German team. And so we had kind of a bad time, you know. We were 13, 14 years old.
Did they taunt you or tease you because you were of German ancestry?
Oh, they just did everything that was mean. The little girls, you know.
Could you give us some examples, or?
Pardon?
Can you give us some examples, or?
Well, it was just a kind of a constant needling. If there was any place where they could put us down, they did. If we played games and had teams, why, we'd be put on the losing team all the time. And then they would try to mimic us if we spoke anything in German. So we just had to give up the study of the language, actually. That was the reason for it. But that's what I remember about World War I as a kid, you know, the feeling that was among the younger people, kids just out of school. And just like I went to St. Charles to the boarding school down there, I didn't know there was any ill feeling between black people and white people up until that time. Here in Jefferson City, when we came here, the students at Lincoln University were all black. But they came here, people in the Jefferson City took them into their homes, gave them food and room, provided them with working clothes in the home, and paid them just a very minimum wage, maybe $1 or $2 a month. And we just loved the black girls that my mother had, because they were over at the university, and they could help us with our homework and study and play games with us and things like that. But when I got down to St. Charles, found this feeling between the St. Louis girls and black people. They said they would, if a black person got on the streetcar and they were riding on it, they'd get off the next block. Or they wouldn't get on a car that the Negro was on. And I hadn't had that kind of experience. We didn't know anything about that. So those were instances of feelings between people here in this country, North and South.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the experience that I had, a remnant of the Civil War. And then there was the World War I, the hatred of the Germans.
Did you work in the Red Cross when you were a girl?
Well, yes. I guess I was 11 when we started to do Red Cross work when the war broke out. And they had an organized chapter here of Red Cross. Now this I learned later. I didn't know that at the time. But the women in town were making surgical dressings, and the Elks had the 7th floor of the Trust building for club rooms. And that's where we went to make surgical dressings.
Is that where the bank is now? The Central
Pardon?
Trust
Pardon?
Bank? The Central Trust Bank building?
Yes, Central Bank building. And the 7th floor was the Elks Club had the 7th floor. And they donated the use of it to the women who were making surgical dressings for Red Cross. And then we knit it. We learned to knit. And actually, I was taught to knit by Mrs. Charles Solinsky. Now, there's a young Solinsky here. I think he's still here in the clothing business, I believe, out of Dillard's. But his grandmother was a very good friend of my mother. And she was in charge of knitting for the Red Cross, for the men in service. They made washcloths, believe it or not, hand-knit washcloths. They made scarves. They used them, a long scarf, they'd put a band around the chest, cross it in the back, bring it over the shoulders, and tuck in both ends. So they were wearing a kind of a vest out of a scarf. And they were made in khaki-colored wool. And then we knitted sweaters and socks. And the first thing I knitted was socks. Now, they're not easy to do for even a skilled worker. But that's what I learned. And I guess I was about 11.
I see you were born in 1902. So you'd have been 13 in
1911, 1912, in there sometime. But that's what we did in the summertime.
But the war was 1914 to 1918.
1914.
So you
Well,
would
I
have
guess
been,
then I probably was 12 that summer.
So
And
were you making these things before America was involved in the war?
I don't recall that, but I know we were real active right away. We were in the war and we were making surgical dressings, so something had to be planned.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't know the history of that.
Do you
But
remember any parades or enlistments or liberty drives?
Oh, yeah.
Anything like that we're interested in hearing about? What you
Yes,
saw?
well, they were raising funds for the Red Cross. And during the flu epidemic in 1918, they closed school in St. Charles because they had one little girl came down with the flu and died. So they sent all the rest of us home, or about 100 girls in the school. And during that time that I was home in November, the Red Cross membership drive was in progress. And my mother was assigned certain territory, and she just decided that she wasn't going to bother with it. I was home and had time on my hands, and a tall girl for a teenager, so she just put her Red Cross veil and cap on me and sent me out to collect memberships. So that was my first experience with Red Cross collecting money. It was $1 a membership. That's what we collected.
Did you go house to house? Or?
House to house. Mm-hmm. And you didn't worry about going out at night alone either, you know.
Did your mother also work for the Red Cross then?
Well, she worked as a volunteer doing these various things. Mrs. McClung, Mrs. D.C. McClung was head of volunteer service for Red Cross. And like Mrs. Solinsky was in charge of knitting. And I don't know don't remember any of the other women that were in charge. But Marjorie Ellis, Mrs. Charles Ellis, who died within the last 2 years here, I think, was very active in the Red Cross at that time, with the Junior Red Cross. And everybody was involved. Everybody was, some way or another.
Do you have any pictures of yourself from World War I in this Red Cross
No,
uniform?
No.
Do you have any pictures at all of yourself about that time?
no, I don't think I have. My dad had a sister who was a shutterbug,
Oh, yeah?
and we sort of resented it. We got so tired of Aunt Cora's pictures all the time that
What happened to her pictures?
I really don't know. I had one album, and I think Margie Dampf has that now.
Is that
It's Roy's wife. She lives out on Hillsdale.
That's Roy's widow.
Yeah,
that's something we can check on?
yeah, I know.
But I think she has that album.
Now, your Aunt Cora, what was her full name that took the picture?
Happy, Cora Happy.
Cora Happy. Was she from Jeff City then, too? Okay.
She was my father's youngest sister. He had two sisters, and neither of them married, and they lived with my grandmother until she died, and then they continued to live in Wheeling. And I think the house that they had when I was growing up is still there. It's not what it was at that time. It's 189 16th Street.
Wasn't the Villa Panorama built about 1904?
Pardon?
The Villa Panorama home.
1908. No,
1908.
they had a doorstop, granite doorstop, and that was in November 1908, and I can remember that being in the reception hall. So that I know that real clearly. 1908.
And that was your
My grandfather.
grandfather built that.
Yeah.
He was the
He was Jacob F. Marshall.
that's right,
He came here with his brother Andrew and had a brother Frank. And Frank went to Sedalia and had the brewery there.
Is she the one that disappeared?
Pardon?
No, that's a different one.
Different one?
That's a
Okay.
different Frank.
And
What about I had always heard that the later owner of Villa Panorama, his wife was from France.
the what?
His wife was from France. One of the later relatives that owned Villa.
Well, the villa went from Grandpa to Otto Watts. And he was here in the printing business.
Yes,
Bob.
he's the one that had a wife from France.
Yes, she was in Paris.
Yeah. Was your husband in World War I?
Yes.
Now, what was his name?
Philip M. Dampf. And he was a dentist,
A dentist.
practicing in Fulton at that time. And I didn't meet him until I came out of Maryville College in 1921. But he had been then in World War I, and never got out of the country. He was in a hospital in New Jersey where they were doing plastic surgery. And he was in the Army Dental Corps. So he had a practice, however, in Fulton when he enlisted and left then, sold out his practice. He couldn't go back to Fulton. So after World War I, he came to Jefferson City where his oldest brother was a dentist, and he went into partnership with him in the Trust Building on the 6th floor.
There was a Dr. Happy here in town that was a dentist for many years.
Pardon?
There was a Dr. Happy who was also a dentist.
Yes, he's a double first cousin of mine. His father and my father were brothers, and our mothers were sisters.
Okay.
Fred was about a year younger than I am.
Do you have a picture of your husband in his uniform?
Yes, World War I.
Do you have that here?
Margie has it.
We'd like to copy that, too. Do you remember anything about Victory Gardens or scrap drives or rationing?
Yes, rationing. I can remember that because it affected the table. And my mother and her sister and her friends were all concerned with the sugar rationing. And I can remember the eggless, sugarless, butterless cake because they baked. So if you take eggs and sugar and butter out of a cake, you wonder what to have in it. Well, it was molasses and shortening. And I don't know what they use for eggs, I guess baking powder.
I don't know.
But I had a wonderful cake recipe. It was very dark and very moist, but it was eggless, milkless, and butterless. And I was in a boarding school in St. Charles, and the nuns down there felt the war very keenly because so many of them had their families in France and Belgium. And they hated the Germans because their families were really suffering. So one of the things that we had to endure there was that we learned very quickly that what we took on our plates, we ate. We were served family style with the older girls at the head and the foot of the table and 6 girls on the sides. And they served family style. The host or hostess served plates. What we took on our plate, we ate, because if we didn't eat it, it was there for us the next meal. And that only happened once.
Well,
We had B size first on here.
sure.
Mm-hmm. See, it came out this way.
I'll stick it in and see if it runs.
I'm going to turn it back to A, because see, it goes from here to here. See, there, is that right? The label goes from here to here.
I think.
Wait a minute. No.
It should.
Where's the? Is it the?
From the Bureau for the Blind. And I'm scared to death of it.
Really?
Yes, because I don't know what to do with it. I can't remember. They play the tape that has the instructions on it, but I can't remember it because, well, it's just I just don't hear well enough and can't see.
You remember anything else about the flu epidemic? Did you ever get it yourself?
The what?
The flu epidemic? You said you had to come.
Flu epidemic. Well, I was home during the first severe epidemic because they closed the school. And I didn't get it. We didn't have it in our family. But it was severe.
What did they do here in Jefferson City?
Well, I really don't know. I really don't know. We were just sent home from school, and my brother came down with it, but he was little and young, and so he didn't have any complications, but it was a tragedy.
What was his name?
My brother, Albert Happy Jr.
Okay. Do you remember anything about quarantines or crowds being avoided or?
Well, I don't remember that related to the flu epidemic, but I can remember before we left St. Charles and came to Jefferson City, I was in school, and I had scarlet fever. Well, we had a big red sign on our front door. And we were living in a big home that my grandfather built. And on the first floor there was a reception hall ran the length of the building, and on the right side was the parlor and the music room. And on the left side was the living room and dining room, butler's pantry, kitchen, and then a porch wrapped around the northeast corner from the living room, from the music room to the kitchen. And they brought a trained nurse in because I was the oldest of four at that time. And my mother was pregnant. The twins were born in July, the following July. So they quarantined us and brought a trained nurse in and isolated us in the parlor and the living room, in the music room. And that's where we lived. Everything that went in to us went into a tub of water that had carbolic acid in it, just outside the door of the music room. Everything, dishes, linens, everything that came in. And after I recovered enough to get back in circulation, everything that we had used was burned. Books, clothing, everything. And everything fumigated.
What they fumigated with?
Pardon?
I wonder what they fumigated with.
I still didn't understand you, sorry.
What did they use to fumigate?
Fumigate? That I don't know. I don't know. But the whole house had to be fumigated.
Do you remember at the end of the war when the troops came home to Jeff City?
Well, vaguely. See, I was in boarding school at that time. I was
You were
away
back,
from
back
home.
in school, probably.
Back in school, oh yes. Mm-hmm.
Or was there a similar thing happening where you were in St. Charles?
In St. Charles, yes. I remember the night of the armistice.
Yeah.
We had a false armistice in World War I.
Oh.
And so then we had a second armistice. And we were in bed by 8 o'clock at that time. But that particular night we could stay up and watch the parade on the street in front of the school grounds. And this was big, I guess you would have called it a torchlight parade. And I remember that very clearly. But I don't know what went on in Jefferson City because I wasn't here at the time.
Were there troops marching in the parade in their uniforms, or?
I don't remember that. This was just on the spur of the moment, you know. Everybody got on the street.
Okay, these are probably just people who were there, and then the troops coming home would have been several months later, probably.
Yes, that would be later. Mm-hmm.
Do you remember when that occurred?
No, I don't.
Okay.
I guess that, well, we, in the boarding school, as we were in a convent boarding school, we were pretty much isolated. We were not out on the town or anything like that. If we went out, we had to have a chaperone, and had to pay for a chaperone and take her out to lunch or to the theater or whatever we did. The chaperone went along.
It was a good job for the chaperone, wasn't it?
Even when I got into St. Louis and into Maryville College, why, we had to have a chaperone if we went downtown or anything like that.
When you were in Maryville, how long then?
Well, I was there 2 years. At that time, it was a junior college. Now it's Maryville University.
Do you remember a Condon's drugstore at all?
The drugstore? Yes, right down there on the corner was to Grand Avenue car turned.
Do you remember Ed Condon?
No,
So you might have got it later. I'm
no,
not sure.
that was later, I guess. I think it was Winkleman.
Winkleman at that time? Okay.
And we had one girl at Maryville who came as a day student, and her name was Hornsby. She lived down there in that area. But she was the only day student that we had.
Huh.
The rest were boarders, and I think we were 102, but we were in classes from 2 pre-primary through 2 years of college. And about, I guess, 3 years after I was graduated, they made it a 4-year college. And then later on, they moved the campus out into the county. And it's now university.
When you left Maryville, what did you do then?
Came home and was a young lady.
And you got married shortly after that, or?
Yes, I came home in June, was graduated in June, and I was engaged by December. So my mother put a year on me before she let me marry, but that's what I did. And see, my husband died very suddenly when I was 34,
Really?
and we had 3 boys. And I can remember my mother at that time saying, well, your work's cut out for you. You got 3 boys to take care of now. And when we went down to the bank to look into the lockbox and open a will with Mr. Schaefer, the bank official, I didn't know what to expect, because my husband was 13 and a half years older than I was, and frankly on the jealous side. And I didn't know what to expect, because I thought he might have a clause in that will that would tie my hands on a lot of things. But it wasn't. And so my mother said, well, the first thing we do now, after we make an inventory, find out what you have to live on. You go out and get a book and set up a budget and keep a record. And that from 1937 to 1974, I accounted for every nickel I had spent.
Really? Huh.
So I had to learn. I was not prepared to go out and do anything. I didn't have any secretarial skills or anything else.
They didn't teach you that at Maryville, did they?
Pardon?
They didn't teach you how to manage money at Maryville.
No. We were just brought up to be young ladies.
That's right.
And I can remember we had, on Thursday afternoon, we had shampoo. The hairdresser came in and shampooed everybody. And we also had a politeness class. And I can remember this little French nun, Madame de Mortier. And she said to us, we were all about 14 years old. And she said, now one thing, you're going to learn to be ladies, but you'll also be wives and mothers and have your own homes. So you have to learn how to do everything so you can train somebody else to do it for you. So we had to scrub out the bathtub and do things like that. And she said, among other things, she said, now, remember this, with yourself and the children, no matter what goes, she didn't use that expression, that was too slangy, but no matter what, keep yourself and the children kissable. We were 14 years old in a cotton boarding school.
Did anybody else in your family go off to the Army, or?
Well, yes, my brother Albert.
Brother Albert?
In World War II.
Oh, World War II.
He was a naval officer. But in World War I, he was too young.
So
There wasn't anybody in my generation that went off to World War I.
okay.
But in World War II, a number of them.
Yeah.
Because all of my 3 boys were in World War II.
Okay.
Well, Roy didn't get in until the Korean conflict in 19...
Roy was my age. That's what I know.
Roy's your age.
Yeah.
Well, he'd be 66, will be 66 on the 19th of this month.
Right.
Would have been 66. And Phil, the oldest one, is 73. And he's in Tennessee.
What do you attribute your long life to?
What do I?
You attribute your long life to?
Oh, well, that's a question. I've thought about that too, but I didn't smoke. I could take a drink or leave it. I kept pretty regular hours because my husband was a dentist and he had appointments in the office, so we weren't messing around all the time. And my mother said when I was getting ready to marry, well, one of the things she did was, in my trousseau, she gave me a subscription to Good Housekeeping magazine. And she said, if you can read, you can do anything. So that was the, and she was a very level-headed person. She was trained as a businesswoman. I don't, when she was 14 years old, my grandfather and grandmother went to Europe. That was always a 3-month trip. You didn't fly over in a few hours, you know. And she was in charge of the brewery in St. Charles, 14 years old.
Really?
Office, production, the whole plant.
When was she born?
Pardon?
When was your mother born?
In 1877.
When she was trained in?
She was very businesslike. Well, she went to business school after she finished grade school, went to business school in St. Louis.
In St. Louis.
But she never worked out anywhere excepting for Grandpa in the office. And she was very businesslike, and I can remember, just like I now, I can't keep my checkbook balanced. I can't see, and I can't write. I can't see enough to write. But my mother hated nothing more than an outstanding check. And I'm the same way. I just can't even keep my books anymore, because here I have 9 grandchildren and 14 great-grandchildren, and then children with their spouses and down the line, and I quit giving gifts. I just send a check. But I can never get my book balanced, because I've told them, I said, don't bother to write me a thank you note or anything, just cash the check.
Don't hold on to it, in other words.
No, don't. But surprisingly enough, I understand that checks are outlawed after a year from the date. I got a canceled check this last year that was 2 years old. So somebody must have trusted my grandson, and the bank here must have honored it too. But it was outstanding 2 years.
Do you remember anything else about World War I?
Well, I guess there are things that I remember that I'm not recalling right now. It was a hectic time. So families were upset. The economy was upset. I wouldn't have spoken that in the words at my age at that time, but I can remember the effects of it. And everybody was making sacrifices. And I had my, I guess, romantic obsession with the Red Cross because of the Red Cross nurse in World War I.
Oh, you mean on the poster?
Mm-hmm.
When did you first see that poster?
Well, that I can't remember, but I remember that Red Cross nurse and the song.
What was the song?
And the war's dread curse stands the Red Cross nurse, the rose of no man's land.
Huh.
And I wanted to be a nurse, romantically, I guess. And my mother would have none of it. She said, no, you're not going to be a nurse. She said, you might just as well go into somebody's house and be a scrub woman. And that was her. That was what the nurse did at that time. She took care of everything.
Huh.
But that's the way it went.
You remember where you saw that poster at?
I saw that poster, and well, we all admired the Red Cross nurse, and she was really a heroine.
Do you remember where that poster was at that you saw it?
No, I think it was everywhere.
Everywhere. Okay.
I think it was everywhere. You couldn't escape it.
Yeah.
And the song, we sang, we were young teenagers and not so young teenagers, and the war songs were really quite dramatic, many of them romantic.
You remember any more of those songs?
I never could sing. I never had a voice for singing, but
Or the names of the songs?
names over there.
Yeah.
That was a real standby. Marched to it and everything else. But I guess at the age that I was at that time, I was very impressionable, as kids would be. And we saw the romantic side of so many things and just ignored the other. It didn't affect us really. We weren't hurting. And so I've had interviews with some of the students from the two high schools since I've been over here.
Okay, yeah.
And they wanted to know what I recall of the Depression.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, that's another story. I said, living here in the capital city was an extraordinary location. We didn't suffer from the Depression as an industrial area did.
That's true.
There was a constant payroll here.
Mm-hmm.
And there wasn't the big industry here that was affected. And so we didn't, to my knowledge, we didn't suffer from that. Things went on as usual. Some businesses failed, and I'm sure, but it didn't impress me. Like I can remember one incident. I belonged to a bridge club with Geraldine Dalton, Governor Dalton's wife, when they lived here, and we were real good friends. And I came home from a bridge club one day, and when eating at the dinner table, I said to Doc, Jerry Dalton said today that they were really in trouble because they hadn't been here very long, and she had done all her shopping at Kroger's, paid cash for what she was buying, and they wouldn't accept a check. And he said, oh, I'll take care of that. I'll call Johnny. I'll give him some money. I have some money. So he had money in his pocket. So he helped Johnny Dalton pay his grocery bill.
Very good.
But in that respect, as I say, I've had a very fortunate life. It hasn't been an extravagant mode of living, but I've managed. Got 3 boys through college. So.
Was at that time, Mr. Dalton, was he a lawyer here at that time?
Yes, he had come here.
Practically.
I think he was with the Attorney General's office, wasn't he?
Did you get some sort of job after your husband died?
No, my mother said, your first duty is here with 3 boys. You got to make men out of them. And said, you're not equipped to do anything. And I was doing a lot of volunteer work. And then World War II broke out. My husband died in 1937. Well, in 42 we had World War II. And I was doing a lot of volunteer work and had done a lot of work in the school and church in volunteer organizations. And on Saturday night I got home. I had gone to work for Mr. Stegmeyer. He had the jewelry store here, and they were very good friends of my parents and mine. And Ms. Stegmeyer said, well, you're living in a little house now, you don't have enough to keep you busy. So she said, why don't you come up and help us out during the Christmas season? Well, we sold more hearts on chains with necklaces that winter. The boys from Fort Wood would come in on Saturday night, at 10 o'clock. We were still as busy as we could be, selling hearts on chains for Christmas gifts. And then I got back to Mr. Stegmeyer's one day after lunch, and he said, Howard Cook wants to see you. And I thought, oh, no, what's going wrong at the bank? That's all I could think of. And so I went down to see Mr. Cook, and he said, Louise, you don't want a job over at the Capitol, do you? If there was a negative approach, that was it. And I said, well, no, I hadn't thought about it. And he said, well, the people up at the Hammond Bakery Company need a bookkeeper. I said, well, I'm no bookkeeper. As I said, I took a course in industrial accounting as a wartime education course. But I said, I'm no bookkeeper. And they said, well, it's not that much. They want somebody who's dependable. Their bookkeeper has been sick, and now she's quit the job, and there are 2 women down there that are trying to run the bakery, and they're having a terrible time. So I went there. But I was there only 3 weeks when I got a call one evening, Saturday night. And then Senior Bogowide called, and he said, Louise, you're going to get a telephone call, and don't say no. And I said, well, what's it about? He said, you talk to me later. You're going to get a telephone call. So we hung up. And it wasn't 10 minutes until Mr. Jack Wilson called. And he was on the board of the Red Cross. And they wanted me to file an application for the position of executive secretary at that time, because Rosalie Woolman was going to St. Louis. She had the job. The first time there was a paid job in the Red Cross here. And she was going to St. Louis to join her husband. And they thought, for some reason or other, that I could handle it. And that's what they told me, you can handle it. And I said to them, well, after I talked to Jack Wilson, I said, well, when do I have to have this in? And he said, Monday, by Monday noon. Here, this was Saturday night. And so I called Monsignor Bogowide and went up to the rectory, and we talked, and I said, and then you stand up there at the pulpit and say that a mother's place is at home. You did that all the time. And I said, now you're asking me to take on a 24-hour-a-day job, and I'm the only parent the boys have. He said, you can handle it. That was it.
Do you remember when Thomas,
I was there 22 years.
22 years.
Hmm.
You remember when Thomas Hart Benton was here painting the murals?
Pardon me?
You remember when Thomas Hart Benton was here painting the murals in the Capitol?
1936.
In 1936?
1936. I don't remember.
I don't remember.
Mhm.
Just check.
I was all tied up in schoolwork, you know, with 3
Yeah.
kids in school. They weren't old enough to drive a car. Anywhere they went, I had to drive them. So my mother said, you're on the road all the time.
Just like today.
Which was about the truth.